Hey guys, welcome to my channel. My name's Sanju and I wanted to take today to give you guys a book haul. This is my recent book haul. It is not just like one purchase. This is a haul that's kind of been like a couple weeks in the making. I've done like a Barnes trip. I've gone to Target. I ordered some stuff off Amazon. Some of this is book of the month stuff, but I wanted to do this book haul because these are one of my favorite kinds of videos to watch. I'm always interested in seeing what other people are reading, and this is where I get my ideas from. So I just thought it'd be fun to kind of go through some of the books, and some of them I purchased because they've been on my TBR or I just thought they looked interesting. Some of them are recommendations from other people, so let's go ahead and get into it. So I'm just going to start here from the top down. The first two books up here are a duology. It is The Beholder and the Boundless by Anna Bright. I actually read the first book in this duology, The Beholder. I think I might have read it as like a library read or something. I also read it when it kind of was recent. Like, I don't think that the sequel had come out yet, or if the sequel had come out, I couldn't find it somewhere. For whatever reason, I hadn't been able to finish the duology, and maybe like a week or two ago, I was just kind of sitting thinking of books that I've read, and I remembered the plot to this first book in the duology, but I could not remember the name of the book, so I kind of did some Googling and figured out that it was this one. So I was really excited to read it initially, and I was excited for the sequel. So I'm extra excited now that I actually have both books in the duology. I'm going to reread the first one just so that way I can be kind of caught up for the second one, since it's been a few years since I've read it. I really like the cover art on these books. I think that it's super pretty, very fantasy. I do believe these are like a YA fantasy kind of thing. We're following Sela, who is a princess essentially, and she is trying to find a partner, and she ends up essentially being sent off to vet different partners to become engaged to. And there's some sort of secret happening on this trip that she's taking around the world to meet these suitors. So it's really interesting. I really liked it. Very fast paced, super easy read. And then obviously the second one is just following Sela on her journey, and I'm not really going to say much about it just because I don't want to spoil anything if you haven't read the first book, but I'm super excited to get into these. So the next book here that I picked up is called My Roommate is a Vampire by Jenna Levine, or Jenna Levine, I'm not sure. I've heard a couple booktubers that I really like to watch talk about this one. I believe Sarah has talked about it. Somebody else, I can't remember who, but I know that I've seen this mentioned like multiple times on other channels. It just seems like a fun book. The idea of moving in and having your roommate potentially be like a vampire or whatever, and I think that there's supposed to be like a little bit of a romance plot to it. I think it sounds really fun. I think it seems really fun, like a super easy read. And I've been kind of looking for some fun, easy, like rom-com-y sort of books to pick up for the spring, summer, so that way I can have something super fun to read while the weather gets warm. So that's this one. The next two books that I have here are The Dead Romantics and The 7-Year Slip, both by Ashley Poston. These are obviously super highly recommended books. I think that when I started in the space of like booktube and not necessarily book talk because I don't have a TikTok, but like Instagram reels and seeing what people are reading, I always have heard these books mentioned. They're really supposed to be super good, really touching. Ashley Poston is supposedly a really good writer. I've never read anything by her before. I feel like there's so many popular booktubers who have read these, loved them, recommended them. I even have family members of mine who have read these books and recommended them to me, so I decided to finally pick them up. In case you don't know, The Dead Romantics is about a author. She's a ghostwriter. She ends up having to go home because there is a death in the family. So it's been like 10 years since she's been to her hometown. She goes back and she ends up finding a ghost at the funeral parlor, and there's some sort of like insinuation that there might be like a romance plot, kind of. I'm not really sure. I try not to go super into books with like knowing a lot about them. I like being surprised. I don't know. It sounds really fun. Highly recommended. The second one is The 7-Year Slip. I've heard more about this one than I have about The Dead Romantics. This is about a girl who moves into her aunt's apartment, and then she ends up finding a man there, and he doesn't live in her time. They live like 7 years apart, but she's in his future. I think that there's also supposed to be like a very heavy romance plot in this one. I just think it's really interesting. I'm not a huge like sci-fi, time travel-y, time bending like genre reader. I'm just not super into it. I know this isn't sci-fi, but I feel like when I think of time travel, I think of more of like a sci-fi sort of genre. But maybe 2 years ago, I read This Is How You Lose the Time War, and that book was amazing. Honestly, one of my all-time favorite books that I've ever read. Still sticks with me. I accidentally got rid of the copy after I had finished it, even though I had highlighted things. So I plan on repurchasing, rereading, and re-annotating the book for my personal collection. And after that, I've kind of just gotten more open about reading books that have like time slipping, time bending, time traveling type themes. So I think that this will be a really good way to kind of like read genres that I'm interested in with like a hint of a new type of situation. Really excited. The next book I picked up is Bride by Ali Hazelwood. I know that this is everywhere. The only reason I picked it up is because all of the booktubers I watch have talked about it. I mean, like Larry, Steph, Sarah, I think even Haley and maybe Destiny have read it. Pretty much everybody that I've been watching or have watched has read this book when it came out. I've actually never read an Ali Hazelwood book, like, ever. I've seen Love Theoretically, Checkmate, I think she has another one. I mean, I know she has more, but I've seen them. I'm just not really into, like, the idea of a STEM romance. I'm kind of picky about my romances, so it just never seemed intriguing to me, even though I know that she's supposedly a really, really good romance writer. But when I found out that she was writing this kind of like young adult sort of, I don't really know what they call this. I think I've heard somebody refer to it as like a Omegaverse or something like this. To me, when I read the back of the book, having like a vampire and werewolf thing happening, it just takes me back to like my teenage years reading like Twilight. I read the Fallen series, I read like House of Night, and I was super into those. So this really seems like my kind of book. I really liked Vampire Diaries. I just think it sounds fun. It sounds really interesting. There were kind of like mixed reviews about it. And the fact that it's sort of something that I would be interested in by an author that I've been wanting to read is exciting to me. Hopefully I can read this book, and if I like it, then I might dip my toes into some other Ali Hazelwood stuff. So the next book that I picked up is The Nanny. This is by Lana Ferguson. I have heard Sarah talk about this one. I just thought it sounded really fun. The way that it was explained seemed really interesting. The premise is really interesting to me, that there's like an OnlyFans plotline in this. I feel like that's very modern. I wouldn't expect to read a book with an OnlyFans thing in it, but it just sounds fun. It's got a little bit of spice. I like spicy books. I don't like things that are like too spicy. I like a little bit of spice. So that sounded interesting to me. The concept of her being a nanny and falling in love with the guy who she's nannying for is just like a classic fun trope. I can remember when I was younger, this is such a random story, but when I was younger, like maybe 13, I was super obsessed with Bruce Springsteen. I had like the biggest crush on him. I don't know if this is gonna age me, but like back in the days of MySpace and like when you had text signatures, I used to sign all of my signatures as Miss Springsteen, and I convinced myself that I was going to grow up, become his nanny, and then he would just like fall madly in love with me and leave his wife for me. So don't really know where I got that idea from. Not really sure why I was like 13 years old in love with like a 50, 60-year-old man. But it is what it is. I think that when I saw this book, it just took me back to being a kid and having like that fantasy. So it just seemed like a fun, silly book to try. So I'm excited to get into this one. Next, I have the book We'll Always Have Summer by Jenny Han. I picked this up because I have the first two books in the trilogy, The Summer I Turned Pretty and It's Not Summer Without You, I believe. Yeah, It's Not Summer Without You. Gosh, I've had those books on my TBR for so long, and I just haven't read them. And I decided this past month that I wanted to. I finally got around to them, and once I read the first two, I realized I didn't have the third one in the trilogy, so I did pick this one up, and I was excited to get it because I was able to finish the series. Okay, so this book I picked up specifically because Steph recommended it in her video. I was a little bit hesitant to pick this up. It is Everything I Know About Love by Dolly Alderton. I did not know what to think about this book. I read the back. It sounded interesting. I'm not really like a memoir reader. This is actually the first memoir I've ever read. I've just never really been into memoirs or like biographies, autobiographies. I'm not a huge like nonfiction sort of person. So I was a little bit cautious going into this book. I didn't want to start off going into it like, oh, I'm gonna hate this, but I didn't want to expect that I would absolutely fall in love with it just because a booktuber I watched also loved it. It's supposed to be a super touching, poignant novel about life and lessons and friends and family and love and partying, and I was super excited to be able to pick this up and finally start it. The next book I have is Before the Coffee Gets Cold, and this is by Toshikazu Kawaguchi, and it's a Japanese book. I'm assuming that this is translated from Japanese into English. I have seen a couple people talk about this book. It's a very interesting concept that you have this coffee shop and you have the ability to go back and talk to anyone from your life in your past. It's like a time traveling book. I guess it doesn't matter whether they're alive or not. It's just kind of like a time travel thing where you can go back in the past and talk to somebody, but you only have until the coffee gets cold and then you have to come back. So it just sounded like a really interesting topic. Again, I'm not a huge time bending person, but this sounds very interesting. I like books that kind of have a little bit of like a lesson in it or talk about life or the possibility of like doing things differently. I just find those things really interesting, really thought-provoking. So I have heard, I believe it's UnCarly on YouTube, talk about this book, and the way she talked about it and how she was so excited about the series made me want to go pick this up. So I was able to find it at Target, and hopefully I will like it enough to want to continue the series. So this book that I picked up from Barnes is Happily Never After by Lynn Painter. I've actually read a Lynn Painter book before. I believe it was The Do-Over, and I thought that was such a cute book. I really liked it. I live in Nebraska, so Lynn Painter is a local author, and a lot of the things she talks about in her books reference like Omaha and Nebraska, so I thought that was really fun. I bought this at the Barnes here in Omaha, and it's a signed edition. I'm sure that they have them lots of places, but I just thought it was really cool that she's a local author and that I was able to pick up a signed edition of hers. And this book is about a girl named Sophie, and she cuts off her engagement with her fiance because he was cheating on her. She meets this guy, Max, and Max's whole job is that he like shows up to weddings as the objector, and he like stops people from getting married. So when they say like, does anybody object to this marriage, he stands up and he's like, yeah, me. And it helps them get out of like sticky situations. And so she decides, I think, to like do the job with him, and they start to have a lot of chemistry. And then the person who hires her to object at the wedding is asking her to object at Max's ex-fiance's wedding, and that's kind of like what the book is about, like all of that. And I'm excited. I've heard a couple people talk about this book. It had some pretty good reviews. I like Lynn Painter's writing, so I'm really excited to read this one too. Okay, so I ended up picking up Flawless by Elsie Silver. I know that this is part of the Chestnut Spring series. Some of my favorite booktubers are Steph and Sarah, and they absolutely adore this series, and I've had it on my like mental TBR for a really long time, but I decided that I wanted to finally start the series. And so when I was at Barnes & Noble, I picked up the first book in the Chestnut Spring series. I want to read it soon because I also saw that Elsie Silver came out with her Wild Love book, and that is supposed to be a spin-off of the Chestnut Spring series, and I don't want to read it until I've read the series. So I'm excited to start this one. It's about a bull rider, and he also like kind of falls into some sort of situationship with this woman who is his agent's daughter, and it's basically about like their love story. I'm excited to read this. It sounds like it's gonna have a little bit of spice in it. The tropes in it are supposedly really good, and I think I'm really gonna enjoy this cowboy romance. I mean, it's been hyped up a lot. I've not really read a lot of cowboy romances, but I am really, really looking forward to starting this series and falling in love with all of the characters and getting a good, healthy dose of cowboy spice. We're almost there at the end of this long haul. Thank you guys for sticking with me if you've come this far. The last book that I picked up on my own was Emily Henry's Funny Story. This is a new release. It came out last month, and I was anticipating this one. I have a Goodreads account. I was scrolling on there. I saw that there was a couple releases, and this was one of them. I read the synopsis, and it sounds really good. The idea of her fiance leaving her, and then she has to end up moving in with her ex-fiance's new girlfriend's ex-fiance or ex-boyfriend. It just sounds so juicy. It sounds really fun. It sounds silly. I know that there's like a forced proximity, supposedly a fake dating trope in here, maybe a little bit of a slow burn. I'm really excited to read it. I've actually never read any of Emily Henry's books either. I know that makes me sound like a horrible like reader, or that like I can't really be a booktuber because I don't read the authors that everybody reads, but I'm just recently getting back into reading after taking a while off for personal reasons. Life just gets in the way sometimes, and I didn't really have the time or the energy, or honestly even like the mental capability to read. So now that I've gotten back into reading, I wanted to start up a channel and share all of these things with people, and getting into the authors that everybody enjoys nowadays was one of the things that I knew I needed to do. So I picked her new one. I thought about starting with one of her older books like Beach Read or Happy Place, but when I read the synopsis on them, they just didn't like grab me really. So I think what I want to do is start with her newest book because it sounds like something I'd enjoy, and then if I really like her writing, which I'm sure I will, then go back and pick up some of her older books to read through. But I think that this will be really fun. Supposedly it's really entertaining, and it reminds me of like a real life situation where, I don't know if you guys know this, but I think it's happened like in the 2010s maybe. I grew up with my mom buying like these People magazines and like all these like rag magazines with the rumors and stuff, and one of the stories I remember reading was about Shania Twain and how her husband left her for someone else, and Shania Twain ended up dating and then marrying the man who was left by his wife for her ex-husband. So I just thought that it was really weird that there was a book out there about it, because it actually happens in real life too. So I just thought it'd be interesting to read about, and hopefully super funny and entertaining. All right, guys, these are the last books that I picked up. These are my Book of the Month books. I do have a Book of the Month subscription. I don't do it every month just because I'm not always into the selections, but these are the books that I've got for the past 2 months, I believe. This is April and then May. And the ones that I picked up for April are How to End a Love Story, which is about a woman who is a writer, and she ends up in the writer's room with a man who ended up being a huge part of the reason that her younger sister died when they were a lot younger. And the book is just essentially them learning how to work together and then potentially falling in love with each other, but then not knowing how to navigate that relationship. I just thought it sounded really good, very interesting. I think it's gonna be a little bit of like a thought provoker in terms of like, what does forgiveness look like, and what does grief look like, and understanding other people, navigating difficult relationships when things have happened. I just think it sounds really interesting, and it got a lot of really good reviews, so I'm excited to read this one. The other one I picked up was The Husbands by Holly Gramazio. This is a book about a woman who comes home from a hen do, which is a bachelorette party in the UK, and she finds a man in her apartment who claims that he's her husband. And this is something that catches her completely off guard, and like she realizes that her whole life has changed around her, and the husband came from her attic, which can produce new husbands. Every time one goes in, another one comes out. And so the book is about her learning how to deal with this attic that's producing never-ending amounts of husbands, and how to navigate those relationships, and talks about marriage and life, and almost a little bit, I guess, of an insight on what life could be like if you could pick your partner or pick your timeline. So this is another one of those books that had like a weird, magical, mystical, time-bending, universe-bending element to it that I really wanted to try. It's not really like a romance book. It's kind of like romance themes in it. I think it's a literary fiction. The synopsis I read on Book of the Month and the review from the editor sounded really good, and it seems very intriguing. The last book I got was from the May Book of the Month box. It is The Ministry of Time. It's about a woman who is tasked with like being I believe it's like a guardian of sorts. It's called a bridge. She assists the expat from a different time period. She's a part of this program where they run with expats from the past who are kind of like coming into the future, and they're monitoring them, and that was her job, was to monitor one of the expats who is a commander, and he was on an expedition to the Arctic in 1845 and he died. And so they've brought him now to the future where she's living. The next year is like them kind of like forming this dynamic. They live together, and eventually they fall in love with each other. And so they're trying to grapple with the feelings that they're having, but also not knowing what would happen if they fell in love and started a relationship, because obviously time is a super fragile thing, and every action that they have can completely change the continuum. Like, it could change future events, it could drastically change past events. So I'm really excited to read this. Definitely out of my comfort zone for the usual books that I read, again, because there's like this time shifting theme in it. But so far, the books that I have been reading with this theme in it sound really fun, so I thought, why not try and dive in and take on like a real sci-fi type book with the whole idea of time travel being the main point. So I'm excited to read it. The plot sounds really good. It's supposed to be really humorous. Okay guys, that was all of the books that I have hauled recently. Thank you so much for watching this video and sticking with me through the end. I know it was a long one. I promise this is not what my typical book hauls look like. I don't usually buy this many, but this is from multiple trips over multiple weeks, and I wanted to sit down and share everything with you guys that I picked up, that I'm excited to read, that I maybe have read already. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe to my channel. I plan on putting out more videos soon, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on videos that you'd like to see from me in the future. And I will see you guys in the next one. Okay, bye!